Well, good morning, friends, and welcome to Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, the characters of the Bible here at Chapel by the Sea Presbyterian Church on Fort Myers Beach. I'm Dr. Jim Berger, the interim pastor. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you and my vast audience out here with me. It's me and Russ today. So today we're going to continue on where we left off last week. So we're looking at this week David's son, Solomon, or wisdom and folly. Because on the one hand, Solomon's this is a superbly educated, wise person, but on the other hand, he has human weaknesses and frailties and failures, and we'll see the results. So we're going to go back to where the story begins. Remember, David and Bathsheba had an affair. It was found out. The child died, but then afterwards she had another son, and that was Solomon. So this is David's youngest son, as far as we know. We know he had 7 wives, plus his concubines, but this was, Bathsheba was the last wife that he married. So David has made a promise to Bathsheba that Solomon will be his heir to the throne. And among other things, David has desired to build a temple for God, but God has forbidden it because of the blood on his hands. So he charges Solomon in the future, he is to build the temple. And as David is in his last days, his eldest surviving son, Adonijah, I remember Absalom killed, they all begin with A. Amnon. Absalom killed Amnon. Absalom was killed in the rebellion against his father. So that leaves Adonijah as a senior surviving son. Excuse me. Adonijah, while his father's laying on his in his weakness, conspires with Joab the general and Abiathar the priest, and says, "You back me for king, and I'll make you my, first in line, my second command and all this." So they do. And they have this big celebration. They're claiming him. Well, Nathan the prophet finds out about it because he's not invited to the party. And Solomon's not invited to the party. So Nathan goes to Bathsheba and says, "You realize what's happening?" And he tells her, he says, if you don't get to David now and have him name Solomon his heir, declare it publicly, you guys are as good as dead, because Adonijah will have you executed. So Adonijah names himself king. David hears from Bathsheba what's going on, and she says, "My lord, you promised, didn't you?" So he says, "Yes." So he brings in Nathan, brings in Bathsheba, names Solomon as his heir to the throne, and Nathan testifies to it, and Bathsheba is present as well. So at his death, David charges Solomon to obey the Lord. That's his big final command to him. David dies after ruling Israel for 40 years. And Solomon is now the king. So his first task is to assimilate power. So Adonijah comes in and pledges his fealty to his brother, but David says, if you cross me, you're as good as dead. And later on, he comes in and he has Bathsheba go and beg Solomon to let him have David's last concubine as his wife. And Solomon says, "That's too far. No, I see what you're trying to pull." So he has Adonijah slain. Abiathar the priest is exiled, stripped of his office, sent home, never to rule the temple again. Joab runs to the temple, runs to the tabernacle, and clings to the horns of the altar. And Solomon says, "Well, that's what he wants. Kill him there." So they go in and they slay Joab as he's clinging to the horns of the altar. David had said to Solomon, "When you take power, you're going to have to get rid of this guy, because he murdered 2 people against my orders." Twice he did There were people that he had been at war with. During the peace afterwards, he murders them. And and so David says, it's time for justice for Joab. And so Solomon has him executed. Now, then we're told that in a dream one night, God comes to Solomon and says to him, what shall I give you? And Solomon says, give me wisdom. And God says, because you've asked for wisdom, I will give you wealth as well. So he becomes extremely powerful and wealthy. The first thing he does is start a building project. He starts with the temple, and he builds the finest temple he can imagine, that they can imagine. And how does he do it? Conscripted labor. So he starts, sorry. He takes every man in the country and drafts them. So he has 30,000 laborers up in Lebanon cutting timber in shifts of 10,000 a month. So you're 1 month on, 2 months off. And he has 80,000 stone cutters up in the hills in quarries, quarrying stone. He has 70,000 carriers to move it. He needs 3,300 foremen to manage this work. So it's a massive conscripted labor project. Are the people happy? Yes, let's get. No, they're not. No, it's still forced labor. But Solomon's temple is a splendor, is a splendid wonder of the ancient world. The construction took 7 years, but when it was finished, it was remarkable. The interiors were paneled in cedar, overlaid with gold. You had the table of the shewbread, you had the altar of incense, you had the Ark of the Covenant, you had the candelabra, you had that was incense. There's another altar in here someplace, I forget where, for the sacrifices burned in honor of God. It is magnificent and stands as a monument not only to God but to Solomon's wealth. He built palaces, public buildings. There were stables, we're told, for 40,000 horses and chariots and 12,000 cavalry. And the other thing about this, that stuff's expensive. Yeah. You know, you try to maintain a military like that, you need a lot of money. Well, this is a time when there are no major wars. There's little conflict in the ancient world at this point. And that enabled Israel to grow wealthy because they were the crossroads. All the trade went through their country. All the trading routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia passed through there. So they became wealthy. And Solomon is known around the world for his wealth and his power. And he's ruling from Mesopotamia to the border of Egypt. So all the way down here, all the way up the Euphrates River. Now, Saul governed this part. David conquered this much. Solomon's strength was economic treaties. So he is building, he's not fighting wars. He's building economic enterprise. He's building enterprise zone. And so he's facilitating trade all through these areas. And the way he does it is through marriages. He's an international star. The Queen of Sheba hears about him, and she comes to visit, and she's heard of his wisdom and his wealth. So she comes to see him, and she's very impressed with him, and he's very impressed with her. He does not marry her. She goes back to Sheba. But he endeavors to learn all there is. In the book of Ecclesiastes, he talks about this. He set out to learn all there was to know, and he succeeds. He really is a know-it-all for that day and age. He knows just about everything there is to know. And that was at a time in the world when that was possible. Not today. One person can't know everything. But at that point, he tried to do that. So he's famous for his knowledge and for his wisdom. And we hear of the wisdom of Solomon. The most famous story involves two women who come with a case to see him because two women had babies. One woman rolled over in her sleep and suffocated her baby, and she took the other woman's baby as her own. And so there's an argument over whose child is this? And they come before the king for judgment. Each one saying, it's my child. No, it's my child. Solomon has the guard, says to the guard, take the baby, cut it in half, and give each woman half. And the one woman says, no, let her have the baby. And the other woman says, no, go ahead. And Solomon says, the woman who was willing to give up the child is the mother, because she loves that child so much she will not let it die. And so he gives the baby to the woman who says, let her have it. She's the mother. So he's renowned for his judgment. And from 1 Kings 3, we find this story, but throughout 1 Kings, we find Solomon talked about as a man of great wisdom as well as great knowledge. But he had some weaknesses. He ends up with 700 wives and 300 concubines because he uses marriages to ensure his treaties. Now, I don't know what he's doing with all these concubines and wives, but there's an awful lot of testosterone running around these palaces. That's for sure. And so he has this vast harem or harem, and is renowned for his wealth, his women, his wisdom, and his knowledge. Jerusalem becomes a city of wealth, splendor, and religious life. And it's a glorious time for the city, for the people, because that relative peace enables them to prosper. And but he has another weakness. With all those 700 wives, they bring their religions with them. And so he starts turning away from the Lord and turning to these other idols and going off to worship with the Baal, the Baals, or the Dagons, or the other false gods of the region. And pretty soon, what you've got is a polytheistic world, polytheistic nation, not a monotheistic nation anymore. And so he's got temples all around the city for his wives, for their gods. And God is not pleased with him for that. So the prophecy is that the nation will not survive without its adherence to the worship of God alone. Solomon rules almost as long as his father. He rules for 39 years. In 931, when he dies, his son Rehoboam takes over, and Rehoboam asks his advisors, what should I do about all this forced labor and taxation? And the old guys say, look, your people are going to rebel if you keep putting more and more on them. You've got to back off on this. His young friends tell him, oh, they can take a lot more, put more on them. So he increases the taxation and the amount of work they have to do for him, the conscripted labor. The people rebel. Rehoboam is trying to is the king. Jeroboam is an upstart rebel, and he leads a rebellion and takes 10 of the tribes north. So the kingdom divides. To the north is the nation of Israel. To the south is Judah. So the 10 tribes of the north form the nation of Israel, and it's just Judah and Benjamin in the south. Israel becomes prosperous, urbane, and polytheistic. Judah is poor, agrarian, but they maintain the worship of the Lord off and on. Samaria becomes the capital of Israel in the north, and Jerusalem remains the capital of Judah in the south. So the kingdoms have divided. This is in 931. So the kingdoms have divided, but the world is changing. Now, Assyria rules the ancient world. And as things transpire, as the years go by, let's see, 931, it'll be about 200 years before things collapse totally in the north. But more and more Assyria is going to come in and demand tribute from them, and will take over the world. And Assyria will rule until 534, I think it is. And that's when, Assyria rules until about 586, somewhere in there. And that's when Babylon rises and takes over and conquers Assyria. And then 50 years later, the Medo-Persians will conquer Babylon, which is a whole other story. But the nation of Israel is never the same again. The divided kingdoms remain. You have the rise of prophets in the north and prophets in the south. We'll talk about Isaiah next week and some of the other prophets. But Israel will hold out until 727 BC, and then Assyria will come in and destroy them totally and deport all 10 tribes. These are the lost tribes of Israel. They're carried off by the Assyrians. And what their strategy is, they move the people all through their empire and then intermarry them. And so after 2 generations, the Jews, these 10 tribes don't exist anymore. They're intermarried out of existence. Meanwhile, to the south, Judah cuts a deal with the Assyrians, and the Assyrians strip all the gold and treasures out of Solomon's temple, and they carry it off. And so it's replaced with bronze instead of gold. And eventually the Babylonians will take all that with them when they conquer them in 586 BC, 587, 586. So both kingdoms are going to collapse totally, but they're going to hang on from 931 to 586. So for about 350 years before the total collapse. And throughout, there's this rise and fall of belief in God and following Jesus. These are totally animistic and paganistic in the north. The worship of God will be maintained in the south, in Judah, but it's not consistent. And there's, under the reign of a king named Josiah, there's this massive reform, and things are going well, but then he dies in battle and things go downhill, and it's from there on that the Babylonians take over and destroy them. So it's a long and complicated history. You've got all kinds of characters back and forth between the two places, the prophets declaring the word of God, calling people to account, and a whole string of crazy kings and queens and characters throughout. We're not going to go into all of them because that's why you got a big, thick book of Jewish history. But next week, we're going to go on to take a look at what were the prophets doing? What were the prophets like? We'll look at Isaiah, one name with 3 voices. We're going to find out that the book is called Isaiah, but we know there's at least 3 different writers in there. And when you step back and look at it, it'll be very, very obvious, the 3 sections of the book, how they break out. So we'll take a look at that next week as we continue with Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, the characters of the Bible here at Chapel by the Sea in Fort Myers Beach, Florida. I'm Dr. Jim Berger. Thank you for joining me. Please tune in again next week as we continue with our walk through these characters who are our ancestors in faith. Our spiritual DNA comes from these people. And like it or not, we got to take them, warts and all. But we learned something along the way about ourselves, about them, and about the God we serve. May his blessing be upon you, rest with you, and keep you this day and always. Thanks for watching.